The Bob Dylan song Only a Pawn in Their Game tells the story of the assassination of civil rights leader Medgar Evers. With the blistering clarity that only Bob Dylan could muster, it tells the story from the point of view of the powers that the assassin has found himself an agent of. In a way that is both unflinchingly honest and ultimately sympathetic, the point of the song is to underscore the ways in which the politics of division are used by the powerful to divide and conquer the powerless. How the structures of political institutions that create and deepen racial divides translate their power into ignorance and violence, and how the foot soldier of that project, or the pawn, is the indigent, ignorant white. And so, the song is not only the story of one man's assassination, it tells the story more like that of a murder-suicide, where there is not only one victim, but two. For in real material terms, this racist white man has nothing himself to gain from all of this violence, but the powers that benefit from his manufactured rage very much do. Thus, the song returns again and again to that refrain. He's only a pawn in their game.
The governors get paid, and the marshals often get the same.
They need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue.
They're already in the
From
dark.
dark night to cool, that's the law now begins. We protect the white skin, since we love his heat, so we never think it's free. About the sheep that he sees, so it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game.
So, yeah, white people. We've got a bit of a branding issue. The fact that I don't even need to explain what I mean to you, regardless of what your political views are, is indicative of the severity of said branding issue. For so many on the left, the idea of whiteness has basically become synonymous with racism, which, of course, inevitably results in a counter on the right that rallies around the most explicitly racist parts of white identity. Because it's just what they do, I guess. This shit has been happening in different ways since, the Civil War and way before. So, in the interest of oversimplifying centuries of racist history, we've got these two sides, each of which carry a whole set of implied assumptions in their statements and in their political posturing. Because the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and the other side are the stories that we tend to believe to be true, and because we're all about narratives here at Compost Modernism LLC Multinational Industries Incorporated, we're going to try and unfurl the stories that are at play behind the animating mythos of the two sides, i.e. the right and the left. But before we get too deep here into the weeds on this one, I want to quickly define some terms that are going to act as our functional definitions for this video. When I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about white people in general, or the fact that white people are the majority in this country, or Western civilization, whatever that is. When I say white supremacy, I'm referring to the centuries of power structures that have worked to intentionally devise narratives of whites versus everyone, and have used state violence and oppression to enforce the racial caste system of the United States. The political actors and moneyed interests that materially benefit from this cultivation of violence by persuading whites to act against their own economic and ecological self-interest for the sake of depriving non-whites of prosperity. Returning to the Bob Dylan song, the individual racist is the pawn, willing, useful, expendable, effective yet ultimately unimportant. But the true power of white supremacy is the king, shielded by a lot of other pieces and viciously defended. But once removed, the game is over. Plus, there's one thing I haven't told y'all yet, and I need to come out about it. I'm a Libra. So, we're going to be embarking on a very Libran journey here, of doing our best to conceive the shimmering, ever-shifting, non-dualistic duality that is subjective truth. Sounds fun, doesn't it? Also, we're going to be talking about race here like it's some sort of steadfast scientific category, but let's just take a moment to remember that that is very much not the case. Whiteness and blackness and every other race are completely arbitrary and based on social categories and culturally encoded signifiers, which are largely remnants of the colonial age, not on biology. On the biological level, race, like gender, does not exist. What do you mean? What do you mean, bro? Clearly there's a difference between black and white people. They're black and white. Duh. Just like there are two genders, bro. Look at this stupid SJW cuck. Doesn't believe in science and biology. Also, climate change is fake and climate scientists are wrong. I base this entirely on my feelings that they are wrong. Alright, so let's consider the category of white. I'm white, yes, but when my Irish ancestors fled the old country to come to America, they weren't considered white. They were just some dirty Celts, grubby Hibernian potato eaters totally beholden to the Pope and his shadowy cabal of shady Catholics. But give it a few generations and I'm just as white as any old honky out there. And let's consider the color of skin as a racial signifier. Have you ever met anyone from Korea? Their skin is generally pretty fucking white. But they're not considered white. And unlike my Irish ass, even Korean Americans who are completely Americanized and have no accent aren't considered white. That's weird. Why is that? It's because Eurocentric whiteness has been specifically constructed as the core justification for the racial caste system of the United States. And despite all the best efforts of various colonial anthropologists and skull-obsessed pseudoscientists, there is no scientific way to delineate people into races. The purpose of this video isn't to have a prolonged discussion about race theory, but the tendency to essentialize the races is all too common on both sides of the aisle. And so it is important to remind ourselves that race, as a scientific category, is straight bullshit. That being said, racial categories as cultural markers are very much real, and it is within these bounds that we will be discussing them here. Now, this video is largely a critique of leftist political messaging, but I'm mainly here to critique white progressives. Like, I'm not about to sit here and be like, black people shouldn't say defund the police because it scares the white people, and the black people should base everything they say on coddling the white people. Though I'm also not saying that such discourses are unassailable and beyond criticism. I just don't think it's my place to do so. I am here to offer my thoughts on how white progressives can better fit into the ecosystem of activist political discourse by using their proximal whiteness as a form of cultural and political translation. Because, as you'll see, it is my opinion that white leftists really suck at doing this, and their incompetence in this capacity does damage to the struggle for climate justice, which is racial justice. And one final thing. As we're discussing these points, I urge you to ask yourself, what is the purpose of political discourse? Is it to performatively signal to your fellow leftists that you are equally as woke as they are? Or is it to speak in a way that seeks to expand and build a wider coalition of people from all cultural and educational backgrounds? Just chew on that one as we go along. So, for the sake of time and creating a cartoonishly facile version of these two narratives, the two stories about white people go something like this.
The left.
White people are inherently bad. White people crossed the oceans and destroyed everything that is cool and good in this world with their stupid ideas about economics and capitalism and shit, and they eradicated cultures, and they enslaved people, and they did a whole lot of the racisms, and now they're the same that they've always been, which is racist and bad and invalid and shitty. If you want to feel any way about your white heritage that isn't mostly negative and full of shame, you're a terrible person, and I hate you.
The right.
We glorious whites, with our Alpha Sigma male Judeo-Christian values, are descendants of an illustrious heritage of distinction and honor. From the sexy Romans to the Chad cowboys of yore, we have bootstrapped ourselves into the divinely ordained position that is supreme lords of this planet, so that we may help ourselves to the endless buffet of fair-haired maidens who depend on us for protection from the blacks, and to bask in the all-redeeming rays of unfettered capitalism. Racism? No. I drive down Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue every Tuesday. Slavery? No. The Civil War was about states' rights. Those lefties just want to make you hate yourself because they hate white people. You've seen it in their tweeting, in their virtue signaling. What are you gonna do about it, son? Sit around, jerk off, hate yourself? Or are you gonna join my well-hung white Chad Brotherhood of Freedom militia, where we stand for the Constitution, for our white heritage, and for our white brothers? Join me, won't you? Obviously, these are my interpretations of the two narratives, but I think they capture the vibe pretty well. You've got one side that is mostly correct, because they're the side that actually takes history seriously and doesn't live in a world where white people have always been one homogenous group of hyper-rational Christian super soldiers. But one of the main points of this video is that the left sucks at telling exciting stories. Like, they f***ing blow at it. The right is very good at telling stories. This is no doubt aided by the fact that they have long lived in a fantasy world where racism isn't a thing, Tim Pool is a journalist, and truth is negligible. But that's all kind of besides the point. To the extent that stories can be wielded to motivate political action, I think it's pretty clear which side is generally better at it. Because if we take seriously the role that stories play in mobilizing and building political coalitions, which is the route to greater political power and representation, which story do you think would be more appealing to a person that has every economic and ecological reason to vote progressive, but who has never been acculturated into taking all of the nuances of climate science, critical race theory, and intersectionality as axiomatic? Just some 19-year-old white suburban normie roaming the apocalyptic wastes of the internet. Which story might he find himself more drawn to? The one that tells him that everything that he stands for is totally shameful and terrible and he should feel really bad about it, even though he's a totally passive actor in the whole game? The side which doesn't really provide any clear alternative to or reinterpretation of his identity, and which requires one to do a lot of reading and critical thinking and self-reflection to fully understand the nuances of? Or might he find more appeal in the side that has way simpler messaging, tells an exciting story that encourages him to see himself as a cool part of, and which tells him that the unintelligible squealing of the other side is just a bunch of feminized betas that hate themselves so much that they want to bring everyone else down with them? Like, it really seems like somehow progressive political messaging has become more akin to a sociology lecture at a small liberal arts college where nobody wears shoes, as opposed to actual coalition-building political narratives. In telling this history and reckoning with the truth, the impulse is then to fall into a pattern of behavior that white people have truly mastered the art of: self-loathing and self-pity. Actually, the closest example that I've seen to a left-leaning, racially honest, and deeply hopeful American story is that of the 1619 Project, where author Nicole Hannah-Jones and others talk about how Black Americans have long been the true vanguards, the true believers of American democracy, because they've never been given a choice but to believe that things could be better for them if only they fought harder. That in spite of and because of all the sins of American culture, Black Americans have held the true stated values of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution to the highest standard possible. Now, for me personally, that shit makes me want to go sprint around with an American flag, fucking screaming freedom. This is some deeply patriotic shit right here. The type of shit that could almost, maybe, make one proud to be an American. Where at least I know I'm free. But, if you don't know already, let's say that the 1619 Project was tepidly received on the right. JK, that's a massive understatement. They lost their f***ing minds. The fake news New York Times 1619 Project hates America. They hate America and they hate you. Everyone knows that racism totally ended when Republican hero Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, even though he was a dirty Yankee that hated the white Christian purity of the Confederate South, even though the Civil War wasn't about slavery, even though it was, even though it totally wasn't. And also, we already had a black president, my dudes. Like, racism is over. Come on. Everyone knows racism ended when Muslim Kenyan president Barack Hussein Obama got elected 2 times, dude. The fake news New York Times 1619 Project are the real racists. They're the real racists. They hate white people and they hate America because they want to be politically divisive by talking about race all the time instead of just blowing racist dog whistles like us respectable Americans do. You know, I just really can't figure out why everyone on the right so thoroughly lost their shit about the 1619 Project, and also really specifically dislike Nicole Hannah-Jones. Like, why would they not like her? So, yeah. There are indeed valid critiques of the 1619 Project, but I'll let you look those up on your own time. What I want to know is, what is there to be learned here? In my opinion, the 1619 Project, for all of its noble intentions and its power as a truth, failed to reach the people who needed to internalize its messages the most. The garden variety, politically malleable, white normie. This is definitely partly due to all the jockeying on the right to create jingoistic counter-narratives like the 1776 Project. But I've got another theory as to why. It's because most white Americans have a really hard time seeing themselves as anything but the bad guy in a story that features a black protagonist. And most white Americans don't really cope well with insinuations that they're the bad guys. And so, this brings me to one of the main points of this video. That white people, especially those like myself that are cis and het, really need to fucking up the ante when it comes to crafting political narratives that are honest about racial history, while also giving their audience a reason to believe that their status and culture as white people is not beyond redemption. As y'all have surely noticed, white fragility is a real thing, and it is fucking explosive. But for the sake of those who feel white fragility, and for the sake of not forcing our non-white comrades to bear the load of this burden anymore, progressive white people need to practice white anti-fragility. To hold space for those of us who feel a sense of cultural loss, whether or not you feel that it is valid, and to encourage those that may feel this way to be optimistic about their role in society. When I look at the Capitol rioters, I see people that have deemed themselves to be beyond redemption. People who would rather die in an orgy of violence than have to face up to the fact that the core of their hegemonic white identity is a rotten, hollow lie. I also see people who desperately need a story to be a part of. As sad and pathetic as it is, it's pretty clear that those of us that got so deeply Q-pilled were just grasping for some cohesive sense of meaning in a world that seems so bereft of it. We need to take a page out of the playbook of the right and come up with a better story. A story which is complicated. A story which is fraught. But a story where despite all the sins of their ancestors and their contemporaries, there is still hope for white people. Because our enemies are not those that believe different things from us. Our enemies are those that have weaponized racism to enrich themselves while forcing us to be complicit in the destruction of our environment. We cannot afford to live under this delusion any longer. It's time to flip the f***ing script. If you watched my video on decolonizing your environmentalism, which if you haven't yet, you totally should, you'll have noticed that I have a particular bone to pick with mighty whiteys who like to performatively Twitter dunk on other white people as a way of signaling that they're not some racist rebel flag-waving hick or something. This pisses me off for a few reasons. And it especially pisses me off if it's educated people from the northern US looking down at and sneering at southern whites. Listen guys, I get it. My parents are Yankees, but I was born and raised in the Deep South. Southern white people have really gone out of their way to earn a bad name for themselves. But so have white northerners. Redlining is a thing in many major cities. New York City, to this day, has some of the most segregated school districts in the country. Remember George Floyd? Remember the Baltimore riots? Minnesota and Maryland aren't really known as being the standard bearers of the Jim Crow era. Trying to transcend your ancestral complicity by writing it all off on the duplicity of the southern white is a great way to be a real dick. You benefit from white privilege in all the same ways that they do, and arguably you, not hailing from states where politicians have long been almost single-mindedly dedicated to keeping you ignorant and uneducated, are more privileged than them. I encourage you to take a drive through rural Central Florida, or someplace similar. Go see the schools there that have received funding cuts for decades and have barely been renovated since the 70s. The deliberate propagation of white ignorance and the devalorization of higher education is a very clear tactic to keep poor white people from seeing the truth. That the party that claims to represent them has never had their best interest in mind. And elitist white people who like to scoff at these bucktooth peckerwoods for voting for Trump as being racist and hopeless are the problem. It's really easy for the right to claim that your side hates white people and hates white culture when you're literally saying that. By and large, white settlers didn't come to the US because they wanted to kill the natives and enslave people. Most just wanted a better life. Unfortunately, The powers of colonization and capitalism did a whole song and dance routine to justify these actions, but they weren't the driving motivation for your average European peasant hoping to start anew. Where I currently live is deeply southern. Plenty of Trump flags, plenty of rebel flags. But many of the people who live in this town have been here for generations. Their forebears floated down a river, barefoot and dirt poor, just hoping to find a little piece of land to scratch out a living on. Were they complicit in a lot of terrible shit? Probably. Were your white ancestors also complicit in a lot of terrible shit? Probably. So what is there to do about it? Try and distance yourself from them because your terrible shit-o-meter has deemed them to be less worthy? Well, remember that they're your people. That their story of immigration and hope, just like their story of racism and violence, is likely not that different from yours. They are your people. And if there is any hope for this planet, then a greater sense of solidarity among progressive white people that includes all white people is crucial. Next up on my shit list, cis white women. Oh yeah, we're going there. Listen, I know that sexism is very real and is an ever-present danger that needs to be fought at every turn. But in my own experience, I've noticed a very frustrating tendency among politically progressive cis white women to basically hold up their status as women as a way of casting themselves as equally marginalized as people of color in order to distance themselves from the infernal, irredeemable, cis-het white boy. But that's really disingenuous and also very ignorant of how history has worked. Defending the purity of white women was like one of the main justifications for so many lynchings, so many murders of black people who made the mortal sin of being attracted to a white girl. The people who committed these murders were usually men, yes. But do you think they would have been so empowered to do so if their wives hadn't been swooning after the white knight defenders of their decency? Who do you think was sewing these dorks' fucking stupid costumes? Do you think these idiots would have been so gung-ho about all this shit if their wives hadn't been at least tacitly approving of it? I don't think so. Oh yeah, one more thing. Remember Karen? Remember how entitled white women trying to enforce the racial caste system via the police has literally become a meme? I bring all this up not to denigrate women or to downplay the ever-present danger of sexism in our society. Let's say that again, so we're really fucking clear. I'm not making this point in order to invalidate legitimate claims that women of all races have relating to violence committed against them. Violence which is so often perpetrated by men. I bring all this up as a gentle and loving reminder that their status as cis white women has so often been the exact cultural justification for racist violence. And in this way, they are just as complicit in this violence as the dreaded cis-het white man. The othering and categorical vilification of the cis-het white dude has been very damaging. People like me who are educated, read into leftist political discourse, and not overly insecure about our identities, understand what it means and understand where it's coming from. But random kids like the aforementioned 19-year-old proverbial white normie may not see it this way. And it can be especially pernicious, and in my opinion, especially disingenuous when this kid sees cis white women denigrating him for his identity as their male counterpart. Liberation from the patriarchy means that men need to be equally liberated as everybody else. Patriarchy is killing the planet, and patriarchy is killing us. So, a truly radical approach to climate liberation brings everyone along.